Now, chapter 24 is about the problem of evil, which, of course, you've all heard many times, I'm sure. The argument goes like this. If we have a loving God who is all-powerful and can do anything that God wants to do, in fact, Christopher Hitchens, in his book, God is Not Great, said, well, if Jesus could heal the blind man, which is in chapter 9 of the Gospel of John, why doesn't God heal all blindness? And of course, the biggest argument centers around major kinds of events, such as the Holocaust, when there's a mass shooting. The argument is, there can't be a God because, any person, suppose you were God for a minute, wouldn't you stop that from happening? Why doesn't he stop it from happening? If God exists and he's almighty, then he would stop these things from happening. Therefore, the argument goes, there can't be a God. That's the argument. So we're going to come at this from a couple of points of view. But the first thing to say about this is we don't really have a very good explanation for why evil is allowed. In all honesty, we don't. If you were to turn to the Bible, the one book that deals with this most clearly is the book of Job. In the book of Job, Job is described as a very righteous person, upright, does the right thing all the time, walks with God. He's blameless, as the book puts it. And then this character by the name of Satan, who in the book of Job isn't the same thing as the devil. The word Satan means accuser. It's like a prosecutor. Okay, he's like one of the heavenly hosts that surround the throne of God. And Satan says to God, well, the reason Job is so good is because you've been good to Job. Job has a lot of riches. He has a big family. Everything in his life is really great. No wonder he has faith in you, God, because everything is going so great for him. But I tell you what, if you let me take away all those good things he has, Job will curse you to your face. So God takes him up on that wager. He says, okay, you can take away, but don't do anything to Job's body. In other words, you can't attack his health. So a big storm comes along, wipes out everything Job has. His children get killed. Thieves steal all of his flocks. He ends up with nothing. And he doesn't curse God. He says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So then the scene goes back to heaven again. And God says, you see there, Satan? My servant Job is upright, and even though he lost all of those things he has, he didn't curse me to my face, as you said he would. Satan says, oh, that's no good argument. If you let me attack his health, he will then turn against you. So then God says, okay. And what Satan does is he creates these terrible, painful boils on Job's body. And he's suffering and he's in terrible pain. And then the scene shifts. And three of Job's friends come to him because he's suffering so awfully. And at first they just sit with Job, and they want to be supportive. They don't know what to say because he's suffering so much. But so they just sit with him for a week. And then Job opens his mouth and he starts to complain. He starts to accuse God of doing bad things for no good reason. Why should I have to suffer this way when I was an upright, blameless man? And Job's friends get angry at this because their belief is that the reason people suffer, and this was a part of Judaism at the time, and it's also an explanation offered by the Hindu perspective, and that is that the reason you suffer is because it's a consequence of the bad things that you've done. All right, so in Judaism, it's punishment from God. In Hinduism, it's like karma, it's a consequence. So if you were a bad person in a previous life in Hinduism, then when you're reborn, because there's a constant birth and rebirth process in Hinduism until you grow spiritually enough so that you escape this constant birth and rebirth into this world. So according to them, if you suffer in this life, it's because of the bad things you did in a previous life. Okay, so Job's friends argue with him. They say, you must have done something wrong. You must have sinned. Why don't you just repent? Why don't you just ask God for forgiveness? And God will be merciful to you. But Job will not relent. He continues to argue with them, didn't do anything wrong. And this goes on and on and on. These three friends have these very elaborate arguments. Goes all the way into chapter, I don't know what it is, 38 or 39 or something. And then finally God speaks. Because that's what Job wants. He wants God to speak. Now, God does not give an explanation. What God says is, Job, who are you to talk to the one who created you and gave you life? Does the pottery complain to the potter about the way the potter made the pottery? Where were you when I created the universe? Perhaps you have great wisdom to understand all these mysteries and all these different aspects of life that are hard and difficult to understand. In other words, the point becomes in the book of Job that there are things that happen in our lives that we at this point in time are incapable of understanding, but which will make sense when we reach the next life. Okay, and we look back on it and it'll all make sense. All right. Okay, now here's another biblical example of how that works, how this idea works. If you read the story of the patriarchs, and we're talking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, their stories are filled with all kinds of lies and treachery and all manner of sinful behavior. Okay, and it results in well, let's take for example Joseph. Joseph is a young man. You know, he's favored by his father. He's got a big ego. He tells his brothers he's better than them, basically. They get jealous. They sell him into slavery. He ends up a slave. Then he's accused of rape. He ends up in prison. All these terrible things happen. But then eventually, what happens is that Joseph interprets the dream of the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh elevates him to a position of great power in Egypt. And as a result of being elevated to that position of great power in Egypt, when a famine hits in both Palestine and Egypt, and his brothers come down to Egypt for food, he's in a position to give them the food that they need. All right, now the point of the story is simply this. Even though human beings do evil things, God can providentially use those evil deeds to accomplish his purposes, which in the end was for the sake of, and then the end of the story is that Joseph, his brothers, and his father, they all reconcile and they're all back together again, and everything is hunky-dory, and they end up living in Egypt in the most fertile part of the land. So the biblical perspective on this is twofold. Number one, human beings have the freedom to choose between right and wrong, good and evil. As it turns out, God doesn't want automatons. God didn't create us as we would make for example, a robot. A robot can only do what it's programmed to do. Human beings were created in the image of God, and so we have freedom. We can choose. So God, in essence, takes a big risk, right? God doesn't force us to do the good, and neither can we expect God to clean up our messes. If we make errors in life, if I decide to become an alcoholic, or if I decide to become a thief or a criminal and I end up in prison, am I justified blaming God for that? I'm responsible for that, right? So when we're talking about human evil, like the Holocaust or like mass shootings that happen in this country all the time, when we're talking about those kind of events, they're not really evidence against the existence of God, because God didn't cause them. Human beings caused them, right? If you want to blame the evils of a mass shooting, you don't blame God, you blame the shooter. It's the shooter who did it. And here's another interesting point about these kinds of events. When tragedies hit, like I remember all the way back to 9/11. That morning I woke up, I saw what was going on. The first thing I did was call NYU to make sure my son was okay, because he was living really close to the area of the Twin Towers. And when I found out he was okay, I went to the church. And what's the first thing I find out? The reporters from the local newspaper are there asking if we're going to have a service. Now, what's the significance of this? Well, when tragic events happen in our nation, what do people do? They go to their churches. They turn, every time. It doesn't always last. I mean, sometimes they go for a while and then they just return back to their old habits. But, when we face these kinds of things, another example is when the mass shooting took place at Virginia Tech years ago, the student body came together around religious ceremonies and symbols, because when we face something as disturbing as that, we seek consolation from the only source you can find it, and that is in a transcendent source or from God. So so the point, is simply this: the argument that the existence of evil suggests that there is no God. You can turn that on your head, turn it on its head. Actually, what happens to people when they encounter this kind of suffering is that they turn to God in times like that. And so, yeah. Of course, if you're an atheist, the argument is, excuse me, if you're an atheist, the argument is very simply that, well, the world as it exists is what you would expect if it is simply the result of an natural evolutionary process where we were not created by a transcendent God, but we're simply the result of a natural process of evolution. And, life on Earth is the result of circumstances that science can figure out and understand eventually. And the world as it exists, the argument goes, is what you would expect if the world was simply the process of a natural evolutionary, kind of thing. So, for atheists, it's kind of weird that they would even use this argument, because if suffering is a part of natural life, just like it is in the animal kingdom, right? In the animal kingdom, when I was in Florida, this town my brother lives in, it's called Celebration, right? The Disney Corporation built this town. And before it was a town, this area was a swamp. That's all it was. It was a jungle, a swamp. So what they had to do was they had to create lakes, okay? And they had to pump all the water into these lakes. So all over town, there are these ponds and these lakes of various sizes. And inside these ponds are all kinds of interesting creatures. There's turtles. You can see turtles. There's tropical birds. And of course, there's alligators, right? So we were walking along one of these lakes one day, and there was an alligator up on the shore sunning himself, okay? So I said to my brother, I said, what do these alligators eat anyway? And he said, birds. Okay, so you can see these birds, they're on the pond. Well, at any minute, an alligator could just snap, right? And that's the end of the bird, okay? That's the way nature is. And so for people who believe that Darwin explained everything with his naturalistic theories of evolution, as far as they're concerned, this is the way life is. You live for a while. If you're lucky, you won't suffer too much, and then you die, and that's the end of it. There's nothing after that. You're just gone for good. So that then raises the question, why would you protest against evil and suffering if you believe that it's just the way things are? It's just, we shouldn't expect it to be any other way. And the reason that question's important is because it points to the fact that human beings have a conscience. And when we see suffering, we want to do something about it. I mean, Christianity, of all the religions in the world, has done more to try and alleviate human suffering than any other institution in history. With hospitals, nursing homes, food banks, you could go on and on and on with what Christian institutions do to try and serve the indigent and those who are suffering from poverty or whatever. In fact, part of the job of a pastor is to be consoling to people in times of trouble. Okay, that's the whole point. So if we have that kind of a conscience, that would suggest that there's more to us than just having become the product of an evolutionary process whereby we're just one step beyond, the animal kingdom. If that were the case, why would we have a conscience? Where did that come from? Where did the idea that there is good and evil come from, if not from the fact that we were created in the image of a God who has standards of what is right and wrong? So the argument that suffering is troubling to us, and it is. It's troubling to anybody who has any empathy at all, suggests that we have a sense of what's just and fair and right and good, and that we're not forced to pursue what is good. We want to pursue what is good. That's what the likeness of God in us looks like. We reflect the love of God when we are concerned about the suffering of other people. Otherwise, why would we be concerned? If there's no such thing as good and evil, then there's nothing to be concerned about. I mean, it's like, I'm not concerned if something falls off the roof, because gravity is gravity, and that's just the way it is. I don't worry about it. I just know that's the way it is. And the same would be true about the problem of evil and suffering, if in fact that's just the way it is. But like I say, we automatically desire to try and alleviate human suffering when we come across it. So, in the end, the point he wants to make in this chapter is that when it comes to the problem of evil, actually, religious faith offers two things. Okay, atheism offers you nothing, because according to that view, suffering is meaningless. It's just part of the way things are. You live for a while, you die, and that's it. Okay, so why would we concern ourselves with it? But if you have a religious perspective, it becomes completely different, because then you have a concern to try and alleviate the pain of other people, and you want to reflect the goodness of your Creator in the way that you live your life, so that what we do as Christians in the face of suffering and evil, hopefully, is that we are shining a light on what God's love looks like in the way we respond to the hardships and the difficulties that take place in the lives of other people, in our families, in our neighbors, in our friends, and in the world at large. So, and then secondly, a religious perspective at least gives people a source of consolation and strength when we go through hardships in life. An atheistic perspective gives you nothing. There's nothing to turn to. So you're on your own. You suffer by yourself. And there's nowhere to turn for consolation. A religious faith gives you a place to turn to. And it's, again, to me, it's not an accident that whenever there is a major event of some kind, like 9/11 or whatever, people automatically, even those who otherwise have nothing to do with church, people automatically turn to the church for consolation. That's where we go. So, so that's his answer as well as mine to the question of evil and suffering. Any comments or questions about that? Does that all make sense to you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay.